Taking a really deep breath. Taking a really deep breath and expressing my gratitude to all of you for the amazing amount of work put in to get the cap over the line, and to do so with our part of the cap in being presented in such a strong way, such a thoughtful way. I think it's the committee has done great work. Y'all have been terrific. And we've got in front of us, of course, the challenge of helping people to understand what we're recommending. And also, as was discussed in our most recent council meeting, finding ways to hear from Vermonters about their thoughts. So not just outreach from us about the plan, but listening to folks about what they think is important and how they would like to approach these issues. So that's part of a much bigger challenge for the council as a whole, but certainly affects the work of this committee. Any other reflections that people would like to make just as we launch ourselves post adoption? Open floor, anybody? All right. It's an uncharacteristically quiet response from this committee. Everybody's either just tired of or you're content. So I'm not quite sure which it is. On our agenda today, we'd like to, Gina, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I think at some point it would be good to know what resources the council has to do additional outreach and to do further study. With transportation, there's some work that needs to be done, and I'm not sure where, hearing from Jane and others, what's available to us in the next couple months, in the next 6 months, to do that work in terms of resources, both human and financial.
Right.
So
okay.
I'm just throwing that out there.
Oh, that's great. Christine and then Chris.
I'm going to backtrack a little bit and focus on some thanks. I wanted to thank you, Rich, and Commissioner Walk for your very able and steady leadership of this group through the entire process. It was very inspiring and helpful, and I learned a lot by observing how you navigated your roles and helped us navigate ours. I also want to acknowledge especially the unbelievable amount of work that Jane put in under very difficult deadlines to meet, with a very early stage process to start with. And I've been involved in a lot of multi-stakeholder policy regulatory planning processes on the consultant side. So that would be sort of equivalent. Jane was staff, not the consultant, but under some pretty tough deadlines. But this was beyond anything I've ever seen before. It was grueling, grueling work for her, and her patience and tenacity and resilience, despite what must have been extraordinary fatigue at times, which she hid very well, but I can't imagine how she couldn't have been fatigued at certain crunch points. And I know that Marion and others have been very important parts of the team, but I definitely wanted to call out Jane. I hope she never gets put through a process like that again. And she did it.
Thanks, Christine. I think there's a broad acknowledgement and agreement with what you just said about the work that Jane and Marion and the team did. Chris?
Yeah, to Gina's point, Marion, I forget exactly what we said, but at last climate council meeting and previously, I've been asking for us to have a discussion about what our funding allocation is going forward, what we've already committed to, what's available, what we're going to be asking for. So I think that's supposed to happen though at the next council meeting. Is that right, Marion?
I'm not sure. We have a pretty full agenda for next council meeting already with the ARPA conversation, and we're going to be spending a couple hours with facilitation around land acknowledgement for the cap. So I don't know if we have additional space on the agenda to talk about the budget as you've suggested, but we do have a nice breakdown on the budget. And I know Jane and I were waiting to hear from the council on Tuesday about when to schedule meetings moving into the new year. But I think could put it on the agenda, you know, in one of the first meetings in January, certainly.
Yeah, because I'm on the steering committee too. I'll just footnote this to say I've asked for this conversation a few times, as has Catherine Dimitri, because we need to know this. Because like in adaptation and resilience and other areas, there's a lot of work that we need, that will involve consultants and others. So we need to know what investments we're going to make, what we have to work with. I recognize that A&R manages the finances, but the council should certainly have input into what we're spending the funding on. And Marion, I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm just offering my perspective. I'm not asking you to respond to any of this, but that's just my perspective on it. But it'd be good to know sooner rather than later. But acknowledging we're approaching the end of the year, I know everybody's tired, but hopefully we need to have that conversation sooner rather than later.
So noted. And I think those of you who are on the steering committee should raise this up.
Yes, agreed.
Hi, Liz. Welcome. As a formal matter of business, we need to approve the minutes of.
Wait, Rich, can I just say something really quickly?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, was waiting my turn, my little yellow hand. I agree 100%, Chris. And I think it will also be important because while we may not be in there advocating for this level of detail, as they think about making new investments, as the budget conversation ramps through budget adjustment and the full legislative session, if there are more dollars needed, it would be helpful to understand that. So if Jane is here today and we can at least get maybe a little better sense, or you raise it at the steering committee, I don't know, but I 100% agree that it's would be good to know. And clearly there's going to be more work that needs to be done and analysis that needs to be done. So thanks for raising it again, Gina and Chris.
All right, thanks, Joey. Initial item of business, the recognition and approval of the minutes from our last meeting. I think those are linked in the agenda. Sarah, it's not our last meeting, November 18. That's a while back.
That is the last meeting you all had on the calendar.
Any comments on those minutes? Any changes, alterations? Then we'll deem them to be approved. And our next item is just to debrief a bit on the approval of the cap and conversation about committee's work going forward on transportation and clean heat in particular, but certainly any other topic could come up. Discussion on what we should do next on transportation. So Joey, Gina, you want to lead us off there?
Joey,
Yeah.
why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think we look forward to having that conversation with you all in terms of what we should do next, but I mean, clearly, just even looking at the minutes from our last meeting, we were in a very different spot in that meeting. We were having a conversation at that time about whether, you know, we might put forward a recommendation recommending that the legislature act first on TCIP. Obviously, you know, we know where we landed on TCIP with Connecticut and Massachusetts pulling out, and now we're in this moment in time trying to figure out how to plug the gap. Other states, I think, are doing the same, so we're not alone. But I think one of the things that we were interested in, having had a couple of conversations with some of the stakeholders we've been leaning on for the last year, is to, you know, think through with you all, and this will be related to the ARPA conversation, you know, what sort of firming up what's in the plan, what can we do with like the moment in time we're in and the dollars that potentially could be on the table through the federal funding. And then the conversation about how we fill the gap. And that is directly correlated to the conversation about what further research and analysis will need to be undertaken. And then, so I think, and this is where I welcome input from you all, but it's been in several conversations, you know, continuing to sort of say at the table with TCI as that remains on ice, but then also looking at other options, including the Western Climate Initiative, another economy-wide cap and invest program that our neighbors to the north in Quebec and California are participating in. So putting that on the table for further conversation. And then also we had a low carbon clean transportation standard sort of identified, and it did not rise to like the full, you know, priority in our suite of strategies, but we'd always looked at it as a potential complementary tool to TCIP, and would put that more fully on the table as a potential shorter term or, you know, transformational program that we could explore in advance. And the only other big, you know, sort of potential idea was, we do have the, you know, the sort of efficiency price adjuster or the fee bait concept already in the plan. We could explore kind of potentially ramping that, expanding it, and using that as a tool. So I guess I think we have, my interest is around, and Gina, round out what I'm saying here is like, what can we do? What do we think? Where do we think we are in this plan at the moment? What can we do with potential federal dollars? And then what else do we need to explore? So Western Climate Initiative, Clean Transportation Standard, and a ramped sort of efficiency price adjuster for the transportation sector I would put on the table. But if others have other ideas, I would certainly welcome them.
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, there's filling the gap that TCIP left, but there's also making sure the things that we said we're going to do get done. And I know in VMT reduction, we're going to work with VTrans on understanding the cost effectiveness of alternative modes. We've got a land use study that needs to be done. The finer points of how we're going to spend and EV charging, and, you know, who's going to do it, where the money's coming from. There's just a lot of work to do that needs to be watched, and which the council needs to participate in. You know, VTrans is up and running, but we need to be working with them on these initiatives and making sure it's all good up in terms of the targets, these programs and policies that are the easy stuff, as well as these longer term issues around the gap that TCIP is leaving. Could you hear me? Because my computer's saying my internet connection's unstable.
You might want to turn off your video, but it was a little choppy,
broken.
I think we got it. But just a reminder, and then I know Jared has his hand up, is, you know, we had estimated TCIP to be like the second, like most like pollution reducing tool we have in our toolbox in this plan. about 26% reductions estimated by 2032. So there's pretty significant gap to fill, but it was never going to be the full kit and caboodle. So analyzing the other complementary policies is going to be helpful and needed regardless.
So I would like it, before this meeting is over, to have a discussion about process, the process that the committee would like to go through in order to make sure that we do examine those, that list of alternatives that you just laid out or others, recognizing that we're going to need to have just to pursue that work and to bring it back through the committee. Jared and then Christine.
Thanks, Rich. Just to build on and add to what Joey and Gina were saying, I want to say a little bit more about the gap that would be present in the plan if TCIP does not move forward, which looks likely at this point, at least in the short term. I think that there is a gap in terms of our emissions reductions adding up to the legal requirements. I think that there's a gap on the investment side in terms of being able to help help Vermonters move away from high cost, price volatile, heavily polluting transportation options, fossil fueled options. But I think that there's also, and those are interrelated, but I think they're also, it's helpful to look through each of those lenses distinctly as well. But the other gap that I'm very cognizant of and think we also need to be paying close attention to is the gap in our plan, especially between 2026 and 2030. We heard yesterday in terms of the ARPA guidance that those funds need to be allocated by 2024 and fully spent by 2026. And I know I sound like a broken record on this, but it's worth remembering that the emissions reductions we have to achieve by 2030 are nearly 3 times larger as by 2025. So if we don't get this right, we could end up in a terrible situation where the federal funding we're counting on to help us in this transition is expiring around just the time that we need to be ramping up investments in a sustainable, transformative way, which TCI would have helped do. And so for me, I think we need to examine, go through this process with an attention to the gaps in terms of what it means for emissions reduction, what it means for investment. Those are interrelated, but especially that crucial period between 2026 and 2030. And I would also say, as I think about it, we're missing what is the primary strategy, the primary driver. We've identified a lot of complementary programs, a lot of things that we can point to that are a part of a broader puzzle. But one of the great benefits of TCI is that it created a clarity and a certainty around an emissions reduction requirement and target for participating jurisdictions, and in terms of long-term sustainable funding, and could kind of in a systemic way act to transform the system. What we're left with is some good pieces, but they don't add up and we don't have that primary driver. So I would just say that I agree with Joey, and I would just say that those 3 that she put on the table, I fully agree with the need to examine them and consider them as possible primary strategies. I would also say I do not see them at all as mutually exclusive. I think that we could potentially do multiple of them, and we may need to make this all work, both on the emission side and in terms of doing as much good as we can for Vermont consumers and the Vermont economy. I would just note, for instance, that California participates in a cap and invest program, the Western Climate Initiative, while at the same time they have a low carbon fuel standard. What we're talking about is a clean transportation standard. So it may not be kind of what is the one primary strategy to replace, but what are the small handful of primary strategies that can do for us what we had originally been anticipating that TCI would.
Thanks, Jared. Christine?
My comment or question isn't specifically related to the transportation conversation, so maybe I should wait, Rich. It's sort of a higher level, more meta level question, but I can just wait if you want.
Okay, we'll come back to that. More on, by the way, Peter, welcome. We're obviously discussing what to do, next following adoption of the cap. And we're starting with transportation. Chris, you have your hand up? You're
Sorry, I
muted.
clicked the wrong thing. By the time we're to the Zeta variant, I will have this all figured out. So I'm curious, like on the ARPA, this funding discussion, given the limitations on what that can be funded. I mean, I'm pretty clear on what I think the priority should be, which is infrastructure to support compact settlement, but I'm curious what others are seeing the investment opportunity being in order to reduce greenhouse gases.
Okay, we will.
Is that a whole bigger discussion?
Yeah, it is part of a bigger discussion, but yeah, we should have that conversation. It's on the agenda a little bit later. With respect to the transportation policy questions, do folks have ideas about how the committee should go about organizing that work? I mean, we've declared as a council that we're going to do it. And right now, the burden of doing it has fallen mostly on the task leads in this committee.
Rich, can I just make a suggestion that maybe this committee invite Kevin Marsha from VTrans to talk about how they're thinking about spending the funding that's coming from the infrastructure bill and other things, because we've been in conversations with him, we being RPCs, about prioritizing projects at the regional level. So there's a strategy there. It'd probably be good to get, the VTrans perspective on how the state's going to use funding that's coming to the state.
Sure. When you're talking about the ARPA dollars, right? So why
No,
not?
this is not ARPA. This is ARPA really doesn't support transportation. That's why I'm curious.
Oh, okay.
We're talking about ARPA and transportation, other than compact settlement, which relates to transportation. But the infrastructure bill does have a direct impact on transportation. And
Sorry.
so I would suggest having somebody from VTrans come in and talk about what state strategy has been developed, because those decisions are being made right now.
Okay, thank you. Now I see a bunch of hands flying up. Bram.
So just to respond to your question about how we go about sorting this out, I think, there are the three programs that Joey had mentioned, and there are others. I think we kind of want to get a full list of all the other ways we can address transportation emissions besides TCIP. And I think I may have mentioned this in another meeting, that we sort of need to analyze them. I think for analytic rigor and consistency, line them up against the criteria that we have been using in terms of what's the impact and what's the cost effectiveness and what's the effect on equity and what are the co-benefits, et cetera. And that'll allow us to sort through. And there's some we should probably add, and I mentioned this to someone, and apologies if I am repeating myself to everyone. We should probably add another criteria. Feasibility has sort of been technical feasibility, but we should probably also add political feasibility, because a Vermont only carbon tax, for instance, is an excellent tool that has no hope of being implemented, right? So we don't need to spend a lot of time analyzing that. We can kind of note that it's a great tool and doesn't work for political reasons, and move on to the other things that are in fact feasible, both technically and politically.
Thanks, Bram. I couldn't agree more with those additional criteria. Joey and then Gina.
Well, a couple different things, just in direct response to Chris's comment about hearing from VTrans on the infrastructure dollars. I definitely agree. We've been lucky to have Michelle Boomhauer and Secretary Flynn and our sort of small group ongoing stakeholder conversations. So that's been very helpful, but I do think it would be helpful for all of us to hear how the infrastructure bill, how the opportunities it might provide us. So I second that as as a sort of shorter term process question, like opportunity. I also, I think, and I don't know what this looks like, and maybe it's incumbent upon me, I have a sense of this, but it would be very helpful to know how other states are filling this gap. I mean, one of the benefits of TCIP is that it's a regional program, and which is something I thought that the Scott administration was interested in because there's benefits to it being a regional program. But when regional partners come, pull out, we're in a predicament. So that's the moment in time we're in. But again, as I said before, we're not the only state that has the obligation to reduce emissions. So how are other states grappling with filling this gap? And, especially other rural states would be helpful, because we're, one of the things that I am concerned about is TCIP is again, was never going to be the panacea, but it's over a decade's worth of work, are we gonna scrap that and look at other strategies? Yes, we're gonna look at other strategies, but at the same time, anyway, long story short, I would like us to understand how other states are approaching the transportation arena, because transportation obviously is not fit within tidy, geographic lines. So I want to really do some of that research and work as part of the next steps related to process. And I don't know if there's capacity and help that we can lean into, either AOT or, with Marion and Jane, or I should just do this myself, but that seems important.
All right, thanks, Gina. And then Bram, is your hand still up or up again?
Up again.
Okay, Gina.
I just want to echo that the ARPA dollars really aren't that relevant to transportation, other than what Chris was talking about. And that's all tied up with VMT reduction, to what extent, a bike path in town X is going to benefit emissions. So yes, we should be focusing on growth centers, but we don't have the hard data to tell us what the emissions benefits of those programs are. Not that we shouldn't do it. So it's really the infrastructure bill that we're talking about. And VT Digger reported, that VTrans is going to spend $21 million on charging infrastructure. And so we need to connect. And we're doing a lot of work, as we know, with VEIC to figure out get the best bang for the buck. But we learned the other day that they're not necessarily looking at deployment numbers that are connected to the cap. So we need to sort of connect all this doing to the cap and make sure that they're going to achieve what we need to achieve, or they need to spend more money or less money or spend the money differently. I mean, this sounds so basic, but this is really essential, as well as exploring these more complicated things, like the Western Climate Initiative or low carbon fuel standards, and how we're really going to need the agencies and to be participating in that, because these dialogues, these regional dialogues, are not something, as Joey just said, we can just sort of do without networking, and either it's not an official channel for understanding that stuff. So it's weird talking to you guys without my face, but could you hear me?
We can hear you, and that's fine, Gina. We can imagine your face. Let me just make a suggestion that some of what I'm hearing is that there are some short-term immediate information needs, and perhaps advisory opportunities for us with respect to things that are happening right away. This is what Chris was talking about and what Gina just talked about in terms of both ARPA money and infrastructure money and VTrans planning. And then there are some longer term investigations that we need to undertake with respect to things like a clean fuel standard or joining something like WCI or some other program like that. So it seems to me that the first thing we need to do is to appoint a small team of people who would sketch out a work plan for us, for the committee to hear from the folks who have information on those things in an order that helps us to focus quickly on things that need to be done quickly and think longer term about things that would come later. And by the end of this committee meeting, I'd like to make sure that we have assigned that small group of people. We don't have to permanently lay all the work on Gina and Joey. I think other members of the committee, one or two other people, could be volunteered to join them and to come back to the full committee with the work plan. Here's how we're going to address transportation over the next, whatever, 5 months. That's my suggestion. And if people want to comment and make that better, please go right ahead. Bram?
I just wanted to add a little bit to what Joey said about other states grappling with this same problem of having counted on TCIP and now not having it, which is, there's enough uncertainty around that. So as we have discussed, we need to fill that gap. But I think we should also keep in mind that it's not perfectly clear that TCIP is not going to happen sometime soon. As I recall, there's a small number of jurisdictions that need to sign up before it goes into effect. And, Connecticut and Massachusetts are out, but, if a small number of other jurisdictions decide to sign up, then it goes into effect. So I think we sort of need to be working in parallel. We need to fill the gap with its absence, and whatever we fill the gap with, we need to have enough flexibility so that if TCIP does come online and is a better alternative, and we don't just want to keep doing everything at once, that we can switch and also stay attuned. And, I think the point of resources is, human resources is really important, because someone could spend a very large amount of time very productively talking to all the other states and not just finding out what they're doing, but suggesting to them, if one listens to 4 other states and they're all saying, gosh, we really wish that it had happened because it would have been useful to us, someone to say, hey, well, it can happen. Like if the 5 of us sign up, then it's up and running. So, I think we need to think about who can, if we want someone to do that sort of work, and if so, who.
Thanks, Bram. TJ?
Thanks, Rich. First, I just want to recognize that, as most of you may know, that Ed McNamara no longer is at the Department of Public Service, and so won't be participating on this committee. And I've been appointed the new planning director at the department, and so you'll probably be seeing a lot more of me here. But my question, I guess, or my comment, 2 comments. One, I want to go back to something Gina was saying about monitoring and assessing our progress towards meeting the goals. And I think that's really important. And I just wanted to highlight for this committee that the Science and Data Committee is working on the framework with Cadmus and EFG for monitoring and assessing progress. And so I just want to make sure we're coordinated there and not duplicating work. We have a meeting on the 15th to kind of start to install that framework. But more in the short term, it's my understanding that our immediate task is to highlight what are priorities for funding, for ARPA funding, and do that by the 17th. So, and I want to make sure our process here is aligned with that. There was some conversation about, okay, how do we do this over the next 5 months? And that's, I think that's important, but I think we need to really be focused, with only one meeting of this committee before December 17th. After this one, we should be really focused on that task. So I think the suggestion of getting VTrans in here to talking or working with a work group is really good, but I'm not sure that that's like the highest and best use if we know that there's $21 million for EV infrastructure in the infrastructure bill. Maybe we can say, okay, well, for ARPA money, that, maybe that's not immediate spot number one, on day one, and we can kind of work on kind of some of the other priorities. Finally, I just kind of want to comment on the TCI, and maybe this is just my lack of understanding, and I have not been in the TCI space. But to me, that the CAP has the technologies and the transitions that we need to have implemented to meet our goals. And that TCI going away is a revenue source to actually make those investments that is now a gap. I'm confused about, I guess, the saying that now we don't have 26% of our emissions. I understand that regionally the modeling is, it says that TCI will reduce emissions by 26%. One, I'm not sure that those would all happen in Vermont. The cheapest ones may happen in other states, which would not count towards our inventory. But two, that assumes, I think, some of the investments that we're going to make or some of the technological changes. So what we really want to measure is the pace of those technological changes. And we need to make the investments to get there. So to the extent that TCI, the investments we have in the CAP that will get us greenhouse gas emissions reductions were to be funded by revenues from TCI, then that's what we need to kind of work on. And maybe that, if my understanding is correct, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think maybe that's where we could focus our priorities in the next week and say, hey, we were planning on this revenue stream to fund this highest impact measure that we already said was high impact. Let's put it there if it complies with the ARPA requirements of low income or infrastructure related, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks, TJ.
Rich, can I exercise some co-chair discretion here?
Yeah, I'm gonna go right ahead.
And I just want to hop in here. I think we need to get back onto our agenda because we have a lot to talk about today. There are some modeling things that TJ mentioned that we need to discuss with the Pathways report. There's the ARPA piece. All of this relates together. We know that the transportation policy alternative development process, we gave ourselves time intentionally, right? To not need to pivot immediately, to do the time, have the time to think about it. And the ARPA money gives us the opportunity to be thinking about seed funding. And so we should take advantage of that. The TCI monies were never going to be available anytime soon. So it's an apples to oranges kind of discussion at this point. And so we should set that aside. We have multiple books of work we need to do. We know the timelines for each. Let's work through what we have deliberately in front of us and get to those things that come next, relying on the expertise of the transportation task leads, VTrans, others, for continuing to work through those pieces. So I think we need to maybe pull back and get a little bit back to our regularly scheduled agenda.
Thanks, Peter. So let's close this one out. And I will recommend that we appoint a transportation discussion group that would include Joey and Gina. Jared and Chris have volunteered to join them, and I'd like them to prepare a proposal to the committee for the order of work that they think we should be proceeding. And I think that's consistent with what Peter just said as well. Yeah. And returning to at this point in the agenda, we also had listed discussion about clean heat standard. We don't really need to talk about that very much today unless there's some news that I'm not aware of. Just, I would share with the committee the fact that legislators are extremely interested in advancing the clean heat standard proposal that's included in the CAP. And I think a number of people are going to be working with the legislature to do that. Anything else quickly before we turn to the Pathways report? Jared, Joey, your hands are up, but okay. Okay. Pathways report. Jared and David Hill are both here, and I haven't talked to David, but I'm assuming that you all are prepared to discuss that with us.
Yeah, and we have, thank you, Rich. Liz Hansen's also on. And so we've received written comments. Thank you very much from Jared, from Christine, from Liz Miller, and we've reviewed those. And we want to thank everybody on the subcommittee too. Hopefully, we worked hard to try to provide analytic support in a timely fashion for the work that you all are doing. And, as has been discussed, we recognize that there is more work that will necessarily continue now towards implementing and prioritizing actions within the plan. What our schedule that we've discussed with Jane entailed was taking comments and having discussion today. And then depending on the depth and the level of those, I think a number of the comments that we got from Jared, Christine, and Liz are very thoughtful and well put, and we can work those into a revised version of the plan to share back with you by next week. Conversation on the 16th. There may be some other elements that are more require a little more in terms of modifications to the modeling. Some of the more quantitative questions, I think most specifically, there are some elements related to the advanced wood heating systems that might require us working a little bit more with the modeling that we have done, and then that SEI is continuing to do as part of the CEP. I think Jason and Taylor from SEI are on the phone today as well, or on the Zoom meeting today. That, and then also some of the questions around the economic analysis. We have a meeting scheduled for next Wednesday to discuss with a number of folks a little bit more in depth the economic analysis. So some of those modifications to the Pathways report might be after next week, but we appreciate the feedback we've gotten so far, and today offers an opportunity for other folks to ask questions or provide further feedback. So Liz or Jane, are there other comments that you all would want to offer on that?
I think you mostly covered it, David, but yeah, I would just reiterate that if folks have comments or have shared them just with us, but want to share them with the full subcommittee, we're definitely here to listen. We'll respond to whatever we're able to today. And if there's stuff that we need to look into and circle back on, that's what we have time to do next week too.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask summer vacation plans while on this meeting. Thank you so much, and sorry I had to be late today. I did just want to appreciate that David and Liz, and I put this in my email to all of you, are really here to sort of have a dialogue back and forth with folks who hadn't provided any written feedback ahead of time on the report, and I did share the comments Christine sent to us, as well as Liz. I sent your comments on Jared's section previously on to David and Liz as well. So hoping today that, and Jason and Taylor both were gracious enough on very short notice to join us too. And I know Megan O'Toole has some feedback and comments on the SEI report separately too, so that can all be fed into the conversation today. But hopefully this can sort of be a common baseline on the pathways specifically. And as Liz and David just suggested, well, we can have a more in-depth conversation on the economics piece of it next week when we meet.
Thanks for all that. I guess with the invitation to comment, I would say I haven't submitted written comments, but I've talked to Jared about it. And I'm glad, David, that there will be another look taken at the heating component of the pathways analysis. That it seemed to me to only be looking at electrification as the sole alternative to fossil heat, which in the Vermont context to me doesn't make sense. So I'm hopeful that the new analysis will look more comprehensively at non-fossil alternatives for in the heating sector. And also, I didn't understand at all the calculations or the way advanced wood heat is presented in the modeling. So that definitely needs a redo.
Yeah, the electrification in the modeling, and I would agree, it's not, it's an artifact of the modeling, and where we are is not accurately reflecting. Electrification replaced basically all fuels. So as the electrification saturation goes up, then existing wood heating, which is often, it's sometimes primary, but often second and tertiary, was replaced. And so I think that there's some more nuance that can be reflected there and some corrections.
Peter and then TJ.
So I first want to thank the Cadmus EFG team for the work that was done. There's quite a lot here. I think one of the challenges that we just need to articulate, and I'm not sure how we resolve some of these issues because they're sort of part and parcel with the CAP development process and the council's decisions, is that there is a pretty significant sort of lack of agreement between the CAP and the modeling that was done. And that's to be expected, right? We made policy decisions that went beyond simply the modeling as it was provided. But I have some concerns about the report as it's now, simply because we have taken some of that and adjusted, or we have taken the modeling and made, put in a policy overlay on top of it in a way that they now, if you were to read the modeling report separately, you would think we were doing things in the CAP that we're not doing. And I'm struggling with how we rectify those and how we therefore treat this report, because I don't want to create confusion. And things like the work that we did as a subcommittee and then a council to talk about sectoral proportionality and the consideration of the 2018 emissions year and how we would establish that. There are ways in which that hasn't been incorporated into the modeling that allows for, say, the non-energy emissions to be significantly less than what we have agreed that they should be as a baseline. And so I guess maybe I'd be looking for some help from from the council members and from Jane as to thinking about what are we trying to do, you know, and this was like my primary consideration, and you know, and please, Liz and David, don't take this as criticism of your work, right? This is more on us than it is on you in some ways, because you did your work. If in an ideal world, you would have given us your report months ago, right? And we would have been incorporated it, and it would be a piece of, it would be an input into the process. The problem is they're sort of running along parallel tracks. And that has me concerned, and I'm not sure how to resolve those issues, because I have a number of specific concerns, but that's really the bigger picture issue. And with that, with dropping that large nugget on the floor, I will leave. Okay.
Thanks, Peter. I was just getting ready to create a committee and put you in charge of reconciliation. TJ, then Jared, then Christine.
So, I think my comments build off of, excuse me, build off of Peter's there. And one, I haven't provided written comments yet, but I do have a marked up copy, and hopefully there's still some time to actually send those to you today or tomorrow morning. But really, most of my comments are on, and I agree with Peter, this is a good piece of work, but it's really, it's the framing of it and how we frame this going forward. I think, David, you've said a number of times that really the modeling helps us sharpen the question. And I think that's exactly what it's done, right? It's just the modeling is an example of how we can get there, get to our requirements from here. It's, you know, and I think this council was able to do its work in part because there's a lot of information out there to start with from, you know, Jared's EAN report provided it kind of did a similar thing, although it didn't have a baseline of where we are now. And that kind of this report has that added step, and then it goes on to the economics, which we'll talk about next week. And so I think those are two critical components, but really the modeling is just saying we can get there when we tested it in a number of scenarios. These are the results. And then it's okay that our actions are in parallel or don't actually match up directly, you know, and that we don't need to actually create a committee to make sure that they're consistent. Because the modeling has served its purpose to inform us going forward on, okay, yes, we can get there, and this is a scenario that gets us there. In all the scenarios, electrification is important. Let's move on electrification. You know, and there's key insights that we've grabbed in that, and that have been articulated in the report that are really useful, and we can use those as we implement going forward. So I don't want to, I want to say nice job. I think it was really important, but I don't want to overstate what we still have to do. Even the advanced wood heat, which I understand, you know, there is advanced wood heat and changes were made to incorporate some wood heating applications, and there's even increases, but we're at such a small level that it doesn't show up well in the model, and that it's more efficient than some of the current wood we have, and so it's replaced some. You know, if we increase advanced wood heat, is that really going to change the answer? I think we need to model in the long term. I don't know that that's like an immediate need for the council in, you know, month 1 or month 2. So I just want to kind of put that into context, and then I'll stop.
Thanks, TJ. Jared?
I appreciate points that Peter and TJ are bringing up. I think they're important. I think I have a different interpretation of the importance of the modeling or the use of it, or maybe it's just a nuance that I want to lift up for discussion because I think it's really important. And that is, you know, we very clearly, I don't have the law right in front of me, but if we look at the statutory language in the Global Warming Solutions Act, it's very clear that the climate action plan we have to have a high degree of confidence that the pathways, strategies, and actions, that the plan adds up to meeting the emissions reduction requirement. I was not confident because of the uncertain status of TCIP that the recommended strategies, actions, and pathways on their own would get us there. But I think because we put the language in the plan that we were going to look to fill that gap, and because there was the language that I added alongside Secretary Moore in terms of when we decided not to put the executive summary of this report in, we did say that for this plan to add up, we need to design policies and programs to hit the benchmarks that are modeled in this pathways analysis or their equivalent, because otherwise the plan will not add up. So I do think that there is a level of which we need to revise this modeling, because I do think it needs to clearly inform policymaking and programs in terms of the benchmarks we need to hit. It's not to say that they're written in stone. Of course, over time, markets are going to change, consumer behavior is going to change. As we do our monitoring and assessment, we're going to see that we may be able to exceed some goals. There are certain barriers around supply chain issues or other issues that aren't going to make them feasible. But the response there isn't to say, oh, well, the modeling doesn't matter. It's to say, well, we need to increase our efforts in somewhere else so this still adds up. And so I do think that there are some ways that this pathways analysis needs to be updated and aligned with the plan, specifically because it calls for some things that we know are not proposed or are not happening. I'll just give one very specific example. The modeling right now shows all vehicles sold after 2033 as zero emissions vehicles. The policy that we recommended in the CAP is the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, which would have all vehicles after 2035 being, it may seem like a small difference, but I think that where there is that type of clarity, we need to have that alignment between an updated model and what's in the CAP. And where there is a lack of certainty about how, if we don't have certain policies or programs fully developed yet, I do think we need to be comfortable with the model to point to it and say the design of policies and programs by the legislature, by the agencies and departments needs to be designed to hit these benchmarks or their equivalent, or else this plan does not add up. I don't think it's enough to say, and I'm not suggesting this is what's being said, but I want to be really clear. It's not enough to say, oh, well, it's a model, so it served its purpose and we can move on. No, to me, it is the keeping us honest accountability mechanism and the kind of guidance for us to help it's not necessarily perfect, it's not necessarily etched in stone, but we need to use it and we need to update it over time to be able to go back to and have a confidence that we're meeting our legal requirement, that our efforts are going to add up.
Thanks, Jared. TJ, did you want to respond just to that? Or is that an old hand?
Sure. Oh, sorry. It was an old hand. I could respond, but I'll let Christine go.
All right. Thanks. Christine?
I guess what I would say is all of the above. I agree with everything that's been said, and I don't think it's an either or. And I would suggest we consider the initial modeling work and report that Cadmus and EFG did as largely done for what was needed and asked for at that time. I'm talking at a high level. I'm not talking at a contract oversight level, Jane. I'm just talking conceptually. And some of the edits I suggested when I did the review that you all asked me to do softened some of the language to articulate the Cadmus work, EFG work as work that helped inform recommendations then made by the CSM subcommittee, trying to separate them out a little bit because they weren't directly linked super tight. So if you kind of agree with that frame, then I would suggest we settle down whatever needs to be done in the existing modeling and document and be clear, just like TJ said, it was done in parallel. It's useful in the following ways, and then stop that conversation, put that body of work to bed, and then say, okay, now we know what is in the cap, what made it through the final negotiations down to the last few hours. And, oh yeah, we're going to need ongoing modeling work forever in this space. And so given what we know we have from EFG and Cadmus, given what we know, Ken Jones thinks we should be doing, whatever, what is the best case model that we want from now moving forward as we begin to implement and monitor progress compared to implementation? It's a new body of work informed by all the past work. Maybe it's done by Cadmus and EFG again as an extension of their current role. That's way beyond my pay grade in this process this time around. But and we build what we need and we'll continue to refine moving forward now that we're in the beginning of implementing the plan. So that's why I sort of said all of the above, because it speaks to all of the issues we've discussed so far.
Thanks, Christine. I think that's a good summary. Are there other comments about that?
Just,
I think-
just add, Richard, I think where my anxiety about this comes from is the sort of the conversation that we are going to launch with the legislature will be about the sort of scale and specifics of various actions. And so we all know in our hearts that we need to continue the sort of modeling updates and to tweak things and understand how different changes affect what the inputs we put into the model, so that we have as up to date as we can, right? Modeling is a continuous process up until the point where you decide what your final policy is. And at that point, then you have the specific details every time. I'm more worried about sort of what is the conversation that we have in the legislature and elsewhere as we're nailing down the specifics of the policy. If we have a quote unquote final report from Cadmus and EFG that speaks to what the modeling showed are the pathways that get us to our results, when we know that we can say now that we don't feel comfortable that they accurately reflect the cap. And so I would like to speak with one voice as a subcommittee to kind of make a recommendation about how we treat, how we frame what this material is and isn't, because I think it will get used in ways we don't intend it if we're not clear about it.
David, your comments on everybody's comments.
Peter, thank you for what you were just saying. And I think you're right. Ideally, the report would have been done before and then used, but they were on parallel tracks. But even if we had finished it well before, probably what would have come through the CAP process then would differ in some way. And I think we need to help articulate that and then provide and think, around the process Rich was mentioning before, through the committee and then through work that we or others are doing, what additional analytic support is required by the legislature, et cetera, then to move to the next steps, so that this was foundational and informed, and it was done in parallel with the CAP. And it still is a foundational bit of analysis that, depending on the particular nature of, people didn't know that Connecticut and Massachusetts were going to pull out until the Friday before the, so it's like that we're still in a position where we can provide ongoing analytic support to meet certain needs. And help to some of Christine's language that we reviewed did do a good job of trying to help clarify how the modeling is supported, but not necessarily exactly what is in the CSM recommendations and the CAP currently, because they were literally concurrent. And so not everything was completely harmonized. So there's a little bit of messaging. And then I think there are then again, there will be revisions that we're doing or others are doing then that can help to answer those future questions or the questions going forward.
So I think one question is whether revisions can be included in the current version before the current version is put to bed, or whether the message is, well, this is what we had at the time. That's a baked cake, and further revisions will be needed in order to align the modeling with the cap. I'm guessing from the way this conversation is going that the intermediate step is possible. That is, some revisions can be done before this one is named as put to bed, and still it will be presented to the world, the legislature and the council and everybody, as something that was developed principally in parallel. It was important and informative and is in very large measure in alignment with the cap, but does not reflect all the decisions made by the council. So there is that in-between stage that I think you're aiming for. And is that correct, Jared? I
mean, that's my sense. I mean, I would look to Jane. My understanding all along has been that it was built into the contracting process that there would be a review period, and that this subcommittee, among others, would have the chance to provide that, and then revisions made before it went final. We have basically a placeholder in the cap right now where this pathways analysis report will go once we've finished this review process, which I think is necessary for a number of us to feel comfortable standing behind it. At the same time, I don't want to overstate the level of which this idea of discrepancies between this report, pathways report, and the climate action plan, because I think they're really designed to do two different things. I think primarily what the pathways analysis is doing is looking at how the benchmarks of emissions reducing activity add up to the total emissions reductions needed, especially by 2025 and 2030. And so that's really clear. And I don't think that there's a lot of discrepancy around the broad pathways that we need to hit those emissions reduction targets. And there's only slight differences between the benchmarks, or the kind of, the pace and scale of adoption of certain technologies or best practices over time. However, what this pathways report does is it nods to policies and programs that can be helpful in a directional way of helping to achieve those levels. But it doesn't, the pathways report was never an in-depth policy analysis or a policy modeling exercise about what will X policy get us in terms of emissions. It's no, this is what we have to do in terms of activity to hit the emissions reductions levels. And then we can say to you, these are the types of policies and programs that would be helpful to that. Whereas what we were doing as a subcommittee was more, what are the policies that are going to align with those pathways? And we know that over time, we're going to have to design them and programs to hit certain benchmarks or their equivalent consistent with those pathways. So that's how I see that interrelationship. If anyone sees it differently, I hope you'll speak up, but I think that kind of clarity of framing is important, that they're doing different things, they go together, but in order for them to go together and for us to feel confident that those are the benchmarks in the pathways report that we need to aim for, some of these really key questions and assumptions around, how wood heating is modeled, why is 2033 used instead of 2035 on the vehicles piece, I do think need to be addressed, but I don't think we're that far away.
Thanks, Jared. Liz, and then maybe we have a conclusion.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I hear what Jared's saying and largely agree with what he said and what we understood the purpose to be. I just hope that as we do revisions, it's not just to an introduction or a summary, but because I think once this is out there in the universe, it absolutely will be used differently by different audiences and people in ways that could be actually really potentially detrimental, and no one would want that, right? I mean, none of us would want it. Cadmus wouldn't want it to happen. So I've literally been sitting here thinking, like, you know, if it were put up on a screen in a committee room, a particular chart or a particular outcome, or a particular paragraph deeper in the report, or, you know, show up in an article, you know, what's the thing that would ameliorate that? And so, you know, literally going through at the end before the report is launched and making sure possible, you know, presumptive assumptions, like words and phrases are in key conclusions, so that key conclusions can't be plucked out and read without context, without someone realizing, legislators realizing, policymakers realizing that they need to go and understand the context. You know, watermarks on charts. I mean, you know, that sort of thing. Like, I'm just looking for something that will provide the level of assurance, I guess, that the report is utilized for the purpose Jared articulated rather than otherwise. And I don't have the answer, but that is what I'm concerned about. And those were my comments on the sector that, you know, I do have more understanding on. We're designed that we're, you know, we're toward that end.
Thanks, Liz. I have similar sorts of thoughts of it's way better for us to take the time to get some of these things right now, so that we go in and can be speaking or singing from the same sheet of music when we're all having the challenging policy discussions in the legislature. That's just, it's a way better functional framework if we're all saying, here's the order of magnitude, and there are specific policies that get there. Jared, I would disagree with you to some extent. Like, I think 90% of the sort of, you know, there's a hard number for the sectors, but there's also probably a plus or minus in there, you know, based on the fact, I mean, Liz spoke to electricity as her sector of approach. Mine is the non-energy pieces, and the currently, in part because we didn't know where we were, you know, where some of the things were, the timeliness of the modeling, we didn't know what those emissions reductions could be. And so those don't reflect what the cap would be. And that will have an impact on the sort of larger numbers that transportation and buildings will have to seek. And that will have an impact on, you know, if the clean heat standard moves forward, what the sort of parameters of those things are. So I do think it matters, and I think it matters that we get it right sooner rather than later.
Peter, thank you. I'm seeing nodding heads. David's agreeing with you. It sounds like we are asking for additional runs that would take into account the comments received, and that we would want to sign off on that before we put a stamp on this and say it's done.
Yeah,
But
I would, sorry.
Go ahead, Jen.
Well, yeah, I was trying to frame this up in just to think about a timeline and expectations. And we had built around the next steps of the final appendices for the cap being completed over the course of the next week and a half. I think that's our own arbitrary deadline, and we should be working towards the best product here that we can. And so I just want to, you know, hear from David and Liz, and the benefit of having Jason and Taylor here as well today, to speak to sort of what we're asking and the timeline then associated with it. And I know Taylor just dropped in the chat a comment around having been the one who framed up and built the model around wood heat, and that if there were specific questions or things that we wanted to dive into today to fully get everybody on the same page around where we stand on this, the way it's currently represented, we should use the expertise that's gathered here today to do just that. So I do just eventually by the end want to back out and have a realistic timeline, and then be working towards that more in a comprehensive way for the CAP appendices. And then my final point, I'll just say that since this is so linked also to the measuring progress tool, when Liz and David and I met, and I know you guys were talking about this when I hopped on late to this call, so you may have touched on this, but where we hope to get to with CADMIS and EFG over the course of the next few weeks with the task 5, the way it's laid out in the contract for the measuring and progress tool, is to really like refine, now that we have the memo on what we're looking for to cover in that tool, what a scope of work would look like for a contractor to build that with us, and the parameters of working with external and internal stakeholders and other components of that. We don't expect under the current contract with CADMIS and EFG at this point to actually build that tool. We would either be looking to amend CADMIS and EFG's contract or building a new RFP to go out for that work. That we're hoping that because we've gotten far on that, but not all the way, that gives us a little bit of room in the CADMIS EFG contract to shift resources and or time to task 4, this one, to really finish it out. I also know that influences the workload of SDI, and SDI is under contract with A&R to support that, but we haven't really talked about what SDI has done or to towards their contract with A&R to date. So I don't know how much headroom is in that contract to support additional work here. So just want to put all those sort of moving pieces out there right now. And then also just recognize and appreciate that we also have the expertise here to dive in for the last 10 or 15 minutes of this conversation to asking some of the detailed questions that people have been posing. So.
Okay, I judge that there were a few issues that need to be reflected in the next set of runs, and one of the ones that has been mentioned a few times has to do with the modeling of wood heat, and Taylor's volunteering to speak to that.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Taylor Bennington. I'm here with Jason Vasey. We're at SCI, and we built the model that's sort of used for both the CAP and CAP processes. I wasn't sure sort of at what point or how we wanted to chime in here, so I just began with just a message in the chat. I kind of want to restrict our comments here just to not focusing on what is in the CAP, the draft CAP, but just what's in the model. And just wanted to confirm that we have explored options that look at other mitigation options that are not just heat pumps, not just electrification for space heating, and that those are in sort of the model's mitigation pathways or mitigation scenarios. They include a reduction in overall GHG because the carbon dioxide that's emitted from the combustion of wood and pellets doesn't contribute to sort of the overall CO2 equivalent for the state. So they are reduction measures. I just really wanted to chime in there and say that that's something that we did that is included within the model. So if we want to adjust penetrations of those or other assumptions around that, and if that necessitates another model run, that I guess we're standing by, I'll say, but I wanted just to clear that one uncertainty up for now. And happy to answer other questions.
Yep. How about biofuels?
Are they included?
Yeah.
Is that, yeah.
Do you model them in also as potential pathways?
Yeah, that's right. So we have we have sort of a renewable gas, a biogas, or as well as biodiesel, and ethanol being blended in with gasoline. The mitigation scenarios that we explore include a couple of different variations for biodiesel, in particular blends, And in fact, we've prepared two separate mitigation scenarios, sort of a central one and one that that explores an even higher penetration of biodiesel, including like B100 in industrial uses, in heavy transport, even in heating oil, just to sort of see how you could retreat on electrification measures were you to sort of go harder on biofuels. So the model does include that, and just like wood and pellet fuels, we assign a carbon content kind of to those fuels when they are combusted of zero. They may emit other pollutants, but from a GHG perspective, they emit less than their fossil alternatives. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thanks. Now I have hands up from Jared and Bram.
I have two questions related to the modeling on wood heating. One is the assumptions around emissions, which I'm encouraged by what you just said, Taylor, in terms of just clarity. The other is kind of the kind of benchmarks that get put in the model around what we should assume in terms of either primary or backup heating, wood acting as a primary or backup heating source, especially in our climate, given at least in the short and medium term, some of the anticipated challenges of relying exclusively on heat pumps, for instance. The first question around the emissions, and I'll be really specific about this, and maybe this is the point of the review process to flag things that may have been an error, or maybe I'm misreading it, and I'm certainly open to that possibility and looking forward to learning. But specifically on page 44 of the Pathways Analysis Report, there is a chart, 100-year GWP, that looks at the emissions of different strategies, including advanced wood heating, B100 heating. It looks at heat pump space heating, weatherization at scale. And what it's trying to do is basically add up how the activity levels for each of those things contribute to emissions reduction. And right now, advanced wood heat is showing that as a strategy that, as I understand it, relative to replacing fossil heating, is increasing emissions. Everything else is going down. And so that just does not make any sense to me. And that's in particular what I would ask kind of SEI and Cadmus and EFG to get together on, about why that graph. And I think there's another one in there. That's the first one that I flipped to in looking at the draft report on page 44. I feel like it needs further explanation, if it's correct, or it must be wrong, and I just don't understand it.
I'll answer quite briefly, and then I see David's got a hand, so maybe David, you could chime in too. I don't have a draft of the report, so but I'd be happy to look at this afterwards, and that might be a question for David and I, or David and I and Jared, to kind of review. So I'm sorry, I can't comment on that chart.
Yeah, I was going to say figure 24, and that portion of the report is ours, and it is something that we need to review and discuss. And I understand the concern on it, both in terms of the costs and the emissions reductions. Those are emissions reductions individually compared to the baseline, as opposed to the whole portfolio. And at the time, that was kind of the analysis that we had. But that's something that's on our side of the analysis and reporting, and so we will follow up on that.
Thanks, David. And to the degree that I can be helpful in any of those conversations offline, rather than the full committee.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Feedback is important. That's what we're here for.
Graham, and then will we close this out? Go ahead.
Thank you. Just a word on advanced wood heating. On the level of a single tree, it's sort of true that if you chop a tree down and burn it, you are only releasing into the atmosphere as much carbon dioxide as that tree absorbed over the course of its life. However, I would point out a few things. One, there's sort of three things that happen to trees when they fall over. They get burned, or they rot, or they get turned into building material. And the carbon embedded in that tree, if you burn it, gets released in a matter of hours. If you let it rot, it gets emitted over the course of months or a couple of years. If you embed it in building materials, it stays sequestered for a long time. You know, the building I'm sitting in has carbon that's been sequestered for almost 100 years. So burning is the worst thing we can do with wood. And I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Brent. Any other comments? Is there a, do you have a takeaway on this, David and Liz? What's your, what guidance are you hearing from the committee? What plans do you have for taking this on board?
You feel free to jump in. I think I would say, Rich, you characterized it correctly, that we're in sort of a middle path of, we're not done with the report. We definitely need to be making revisions, including the ones that have been pointed out here that will necessitate sort of an additional run of the model. And then there's likely some things that go into the future research or sort of part of the monitoring and assessment process that Jane mentioned. So I think it's for David and I to get together and respond to Jane's comment based on how much updating to the model there is and how that process will unfold, sort of the timeline for that, which we heard requested. I think if you haven't gotten us comments and you do have a comment that specifically relates to something you would like to see that would require sort of a tweak to the fundamental modeling, not just sort of the language of how it's presented, please get that to us as soon as possible so that we can make sure we have a full inventory of what's being requested that we can review with Jane and make sure we can do it all or set the right priorities. And then certainly hearing loud and clear around sort of the language and the caveating and Liz's request for disclaimers in the footer in the paragraphs on the charts, doing that. So I think we'll push ahead with the text edits that we can make for clarity ahead of our meeting next week. If you all can get us requests for modeling, we can maybe talk about those. And if we have questions for you about how to shape those up, David, feel free to jump in here. We can talk about those next week and make sure we have a timeline for when that will be wrapped up.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And the points that I think Peter and Liz made about, you know, given where we are, how do we work forward to have the pathways report be as strong a support for the CAP as adopted, and then for future decision-making, to inform future decision-making. It's to the degree we have the time to do that, it's important and worth spending the time now. So we appreciate the feedback, and we recognize there are things that we can address and put us in a better position to answer questions going forward.
All right, thanks. I think the request to the committee is, if you have additional comments, please submit them right away. And
yeah, I guess the question is, what is that right of way?
Yeah,
right away.
My guess is, I mean, I don't know, Jane and Liz, feel free here, but we have a meeting scheduled for economic analysis next Wednesday. It is, we don't want to set a right away and then therefore not get comments back. But we also want to try to be efficient and expedient. So I would say that if we got any comments by, say, the end of the day, Monday or something, we're gathering feedback. On Wednesday, we're going to have a more in-depth discussion on the economic analysis. We can take a lot of the edits that we've had that are very helpful in terms of clarifying language and putting Christine's comments on finer points on certain elements and things like that. We can incorporate those into the report now. But I would think that it would be appropriate and helpful, if it works for all of you, to say by Monday we would need to have comments back. end of day Monday.
So I'm not seeing anybody going, that doesn't work. I think that's fair. I think part of it was we were looking for this discussion with you all as we were working through our thoughts. It might behoove the group to have a smaller body, have some, as the model is being updated, to get some direct feedback from, so that you're not trying to interpret our comments and then going forth and then we get it back and it's not precisely as we sort of intended the feedback, what the feedback to mean, and just might shorten that cycle a little bit, if there are folks that are interested in that process.
Yeah, I actually was going to ask, we have a work group specific on the economic modeling that we've leaned on when there have been questions and things to arise on that. TJ or Jared, did we have a specific group who was looking at the pathways report? And I'm sure, I know TJ was, and you were, Jared, but I can't think of if we want to broaden that or just revisit who wants to do that from now on.
My recollection from the last cross-sector meeting was that initial group was Liz, Christine, and myself. I shared the report with the full Science and Data Subcommittee, but we didn't form like a task group on the Pathways report. I think it would be good to open up the possibility for, I think TJ's got comments and that would be great. And then, but we did have a standing kind of economic analysis review group that from the Science and Data Subcommittee, which was TJ, myself, Ken Jones, and I believe Lou.
Yeah, and Peter and Julie have been involved in that
yes.
as well.
So are we agreed to stick with that group?
I think I appreciate that Liz has offered. I know there are questions around the electric sector, so that I appreciate if Liz has the time, and then Christine, you have your hand up, so check in with you on what your thoughts are on that.
Okay.
Well, I think this has been a great discussion. I like the direction this is headed. I'm a person who receives people's models and results, not goes deep in reviewing them. So I feel like I've done my review, and I defer to others on the inner workings of the modeling and how they need to be changed.
Thanks, Christine. Anyway, Liz, Jared, and Jane, you mentioned also Peter. Okay.
TJ, I would imagine.
TJ.
Yeah, and
okay, there you go.
And Peter, I imagine, I'm not sure if you personally want to be involved, but I know Megan and Colin are giving a lot of thought to this too. So that's good.
Yeah,
DEC staff at some
Megan,
level.
Colin, and Brian Woods can definitely help support as well.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. This is Megan. The air quality team definitely has some comments that we'd like to, so we'd like to participate if that's possible. Thank you.
So do we want to, does it sound like we'll set up then something similar to the economic review meeting that's happening next Wednesday for kind of a modeling review meeting, and we can plan for that, and hopefully Taylor and Jason can also participate in that. I think would be the best way to approach that.
Taylor has volunteered.
All right, thank you everybody for a thoughtful conversation and a plan.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Jane,
we're just a little bit behind on the agenda, but you're slated to talk to us about the ARPA process. So it's over to you.
Thanks. So I've been working to draft some subcommittee guidance based on the council conversation on Tuesday for your subcommittee, Rural Resilience and Ag and Ecosystems, to essentially have a stake in putting forward prioritized actions to consider for ARPA funding. And I will just say that I look forward, you are all the first guinea pigs to see this. Marianne just dropped in the chat the PDF that we worked on and that she posted right before this meeting for you all. I'm happy to walk us through it briefly, but just want to suggest that the council meeting, I had hoped that the council meeting would set sort of really clear guidance on sort of the number and level of detail we wanted for projects, but it didn't really get to that level of specificity that I had hoped for. So I took what we had from my notes from that meeting, as well as David's, and really tried to suss out some clear guidance for the subcommittees, understanding that this is a little bit interpreted by myself and others. So let me walk you through it with the understanding and expectation that just a reminder that, you know, this is really for the benefit of the council to be able to weigh in and help inform the budget development by both the legislature and the governor. We have the roughly $200 million with the intent to go to climate action and implementation of the plan itself. But really, this is guidance. This is not a declaration of how those funds will be spent. I think that both we have clear indication from both the governor and the legislature that they're looking to the council for this guidance. But what was really determined based on the council, for the benefit of other subcommittee members who weren't there, was that the intent would be to put forward a memo to the governor and the legislature from the council that sets sort of forward the broad parameters and guidance for how we think the $200 million should be directed from ARPA into climate action, recognizing and building upon ARPA dollars that are already being invested in climate action that is sort of outside of scope of the actual dollars directed to the council, but specifically overlaps with the recommendations that we have in the climate action plan. So we built upon our knowledge of that with the council on Tuesday, understanding the parameters of ARPA dollars, but also thinking about the investments currently being made in broadband, water infrastructure, housing, and other areas. So hopefully this would set forward further priorities around the guidance of how we'd like to see those dollars invested, as well as put forward the priority actions that we see as the top ready to go, ready to implement actions for ARPA dollars. But again, it's not a declaration of how the money will be spent. So our hope is that each subcommittee, the 3 subcommittees, will put forward 3 to 5 priority actions for the council to either take all of them or refine down to a list of top 10. That direct guidance from the council wasn't clear, and so that's where I'm struggling with how much like specificity to tell you all. So briefly, let me just share with you. So this is, I'm going to email this around to the 3 subcommittees that are participating in putting forward this process, but the council meets next on the 21st of December with the goal of adopting a suite of recommended actions to put forward in a memo that I imagine I will draft on behalf of the council after that meeting. And so this will go out to those 3 subcommittees. You essentially have till next Friday to put forward your written word to me to then share with the council for the meeting on the 21st. So there's just some broad overview at the top that speaks to what we were able, where the 200 million is coming from, what we spoke to in the climate action plan about the immediate need for the council to come back once the plan was adopted. So therefore we had this suite of priorities to look at for that overlap and work well with ARPA dollars. And that we spoke right in the cap to an addendum that would come in the month of December to inform the governor's budget address and ultimately the legislative session around ARPA dollars. So again, $200 million, it's building upon additional funds for climate action. The role of the council, this is not a requirement of the GWSA. This is really our opportunity to work in concert to all put forward a suite of recommendations. I've really tried to provide as much clarity here as possible, but the parameters for ARPA are really broad. Cross-sector and emissions reductions projects really do align best with ARPA dollars, but resilience, as well as I would argue for ag and ecosystems like agricultural mitigation projects, things like that will align well also. But the 2 main priority areas, the first and foremost is if they should all serve low-income Vermonters, like, and I expect the council to go further by setting some thresholds for how much money specifically of that $200 million should be put forward to marginalized communities in Vermont, not dissimilar from what New York State is doing, and there's a link to that below, as well as the Biden administration's objectives. So further than that, their infrastructure or implementation focus, so just like key for other components of the cap, planning in and of itself is only eligible if it leads to infrastructure development or job creation. We can't just plan for the sake of planning with these dollars. And then specifically, Secretary Moore wanted me to put in and highlight that most impacted, the only articulated impacted industry from COVID, which is highlighted with ARPA, is travel and tourism. And so like that's how the link specifically has been made to charging stations that are being funded right now with ARPA dollars in downtown areas. It's a way to suggest that we get people visiting Vermont and visiting our downtowns is by providing these kinds of services. So these kinds of links have to be made when we're thinking about how we direct the ARPA dollars. And again, we're not looking at sort of starting up new programs or priorities with these monies because they have to be obligated by the end of 2024. So we really want to think about projects that are ready or close to ready for implementation. So the criteria that we're putting forward for subcommittees is to prioritize no more than 3 to 5 actions to share with the council that are ready. Where possible, we're asking that subcommittees, if you can, speak to the maximum amount of funding that you think you could put on the ground for this action. So therefore, if you said we could put forward, $50 million for EV charging, we want to know that if the governor or the legislature gives $40 million, that's within the range of what you could feel like could be spent on this action in the given time frame. And then the council went further to talk specifically about, we know we've prioritized actions for inclusion in the cap already based on foundational criteria, but specific to this process beyond what is ready to implement, we wanted to really further actions that really have the biggest impact. I've pasted for folks' remembrance below the definitions that we put forward for prioritization, but in this case, actions that reduce emissions to the greatest benefit possible. We wanted to think specifically about the most equitable actions that we can to put forward and further prioritize. And then specifically outside of also cost effectiveness, which we talked about in the already with prioritization, we wanted to think and recognize that these funds are short term. And so that where they can leverage and we can take down barriers to implement future actions based on the use of these funds, that makes a lot of sense. So the idea here is just a 1-paragraph write-up on the 3 to 5 actions that your subcommittee puts forward. A lot of that information can draw on the writing that was already done for the climate action plan. I would hope it won't be a lot of work. The hard work is for you all coming to consensus on what those 3 to 5 actions should be to put forward to the council. And ultimately, those will be discussed, reviewed, considered by the council at large at the meeting on the 21st. And then ultimately put forward into the memo from the council to the governor and the legislature, hopefully to inform both the governor's address at the beginning of the year as well as the legislative session. So I'll email this around. It's also posted with today, and I'll stop sharing to let the conversation happen. I see Christine has her hand up.
Christine?
You're muted, so.
You're muted. You're still muted.
My apologies. I feel very unqualified to fulfill this assignment, and I'm curious why the conversation isn't happening more at the agency head or program head level in areas where it's clear there's priority in the cap, like weatherization at scale, electrification of the vehicle fleet, electric charging infrastructure. Presumably there are people in state government who ultimately will end up being responsible for overseeing the work to achieve such examples of those broad initiatives, why wouldn't they be the people being convened as agency or program or department heads and said, okay, here's what they're saying about the cap. Obviously, weatherization is big. You who oversee weatherization, how many millions of dollars do you think should be directed from this 200 million? I would just be guessing. So help me understand why we're the ones having this conversation and how and the basis for thinking we're learned enough to know what these numbers should be.
I imagine Peter's going to speak to this too, but well, I'll let you go first and then I'll give you my take too.
Thanks, Jane. So that's a very good question. I think the legislature was looking for a broad perspective of voices on how to prioritize these monies. I think as it gets into the legislative process, certainly the state agencies that are involved have the expertise to refine some of those values and to present them as refined values to what they would go to. But I think the desire was for a perspective that expanded beyond state agencies, because there was a perspective that was put forward during the legislative session last year, and it wasn't taken up in full. That honestly is going to look fairly similar to some of the priorities that we put forward as a council now. And so we'll see how that shakes out. Certainly, in the absence of the council making a recommendation, there will be a governor's budget proposal that includes the recommendations of state agencies. So I think it's an overlapping process, I guess is what I would say.
Thank you.
I put my hand up to ask a question and to make a comment. And the question, Jane, you said, write a paragraph. Are you suggesting a paragraph in total or a paragraph for each of the 3 or 5 ideas?
Each.
Okay. And I'll make a general comment that there's a big debate going on about what is the definition of infrastructure. And there are a lot of dimensions to that debate, but one of the dimensions is the question whether the housing stock of the nation is actually part of the infrastructure of the nation. And I would argue that it is, and that, or the building stock generally, including the housing stock, and that therefore it's consistent with the goals, the twin goals of assisting low-income families and improving the infrastructure of the nation. If we were to devote ARPA funds to improving the building fabric and the heating systems that we have in buildings. And so I wouldn't have any trouble recommending that a significant fraction of the funding be devoted to those twin and married objectives of weatherization and heating system improvements. Joey, and then Jared and Liz.
I agree. And based on what Doug was saying, I think there's discretion, but discretion within very clear parameters. And I wonder, and there probably is more, a more clear analysis of what are those things that are like definitely eligible and what definitely is not, that would help inform this thinking a little further. One of the questions I have is, well, first of all, I can't recall, do people know, or is this a question for Doug Farnham? Like if we're going to recommend, scaling up low-income weatherization, there's a lot of, challenges around that. Is there an administrative cap to do that? Because we don't want to recommend that we ask some of our partner organizations to do this work without giving them the the tools and the resources to do it. So do people know that answer? Is it 10%, 15%? Do we know? Okay. And then my other question is,
I mean, probably Peter can speak to this too, but it has felt like this second time around that they've been much more open to staffing up for ARPA dollars in state government than the first time. I know our agency is getting quite a few positions now to help spend down the ARPA dollars coming to A&R, which wasn't the case a year and a half or whenever the first slug came in a year ago. And so I imagine there's both the capacity and the challenge there has to do with how state government approves positions also and allocates positions to stand up these programs. But I just put in the chat, but weatherization is a really interesting one, since the only state government program that really pays for weatherization and funds that right now is within Sarah's shop, within OEO. And the question has been asked to them, how do they want to broaden their scope? Do they want to be, the weatherization shop? And there are like these larger questions of scaling up that have to happen across state government also, I think.
that's helpful, Jane. And just in general, I want to step back and thank you and everyone for, I appreciate your question, Christine, but I do think, considering all the work we've been doing, just to having opportunity to offer some thoughts into this conversation, I think is really, I appreciate it. And I think it could be helpful. My question is also like, well, can we recommend it going to an entity or entities that are doing this, that may be good partners to do this work? Like, meaning we not as clear specificity around exact programs, but people who can do further work to deliver like most cost-effective strategic investments. Like maybe it's just because anyway, like the Clean Energy Development Fund, and I'm on that. I'm not saying that we should do it, but there are partners in the state of Vermont like that could be doing this work. Can we recommend putting dollars into those sort of existing systems and existing infrastructure? That's one thing that I would be sort of inclined to do, like our CAP agencies, but we'd want to capacitate them.
Jared and Liz.
We can certainly, I think, get to the question of what I don't believe there are any administrative cap limit. I think the legislature appropriated a certain amount for state agencies to administer those funds, with the intent that that would be therefore limited so that most of the money could go to project dollars. That said, that was a state decision. So I can check in on the question around whether or not there, but I don't believe there is. And we would typically run additional weatherization dollars, as we have done over the past few years, through the standard processes by which we've done them. If we're considering other options, that's when I think we should maybe raise those potential other pathways. But we have existing structures in place, and if we think those are appropriate, then the recommendation can speak to scaling up those resources, those teams appropriately.
I would just offer a substantive point and then a process question or suggestion. I think on the substance, the reason for the council to be making these recommendations, I think it is very important because we are the closest to the climate action plan. And of course, we're working in close collaboration with the agency and with legislators. But I do think that we have a unique position and responsibility to make sure that we're making recommendations that we feel confident can help us achieve the aims and the requirements of the law. On a process, and I would also just say on the weatherization side, I take your point, Jane, that there's kind of one state kind of weatherization kind of spot in state government. But I would also note that in the past, when there have been public investments made in weatherization, they don't necessarily all go through the state. So last year, there were investments made through Vermont Housing Finance Authority, Efficiency Vermont, and I think we need to kind of keep in mind that there's a whole ecosystem that can help ramp and scale a lot of this work that's not just in state government, even if a lot of it originates with or flows through. But on a process perspective, I'm just thinking about, like, given the timeline you laid out, Jane, that these recommendations need to come in by Friday, I wonder if we want to suggest something like if people have language or paragraphs on specific things, have them in, by next Wednesday so that we can discuss them at next Thursday's meeting. I feel like that's the only time we're going to have to do this, right? And maybe, I think originally that agenda was more on the pathways review, but if we're setting up a subgroup that's going to dive a little bit more deeply with CADMIS and EFG and SCI, maybe that's not as necessary, and we have the opportunity to devote more of our meeting next Thursday to coming up with hopefully a consensus recommendation, or at least some semblance of a recommendation afterwards, so it's ready by next Friday.
Thanks, Jared. We'll come back to that in a minute. Liz?
Yeah, no, Jared's question's a good one just on process, because I was not planning to throw out ideas today, but since people are starting to, I just want to make sure we think about able to implement in terms of, kind of current programs, but also current programs that have already gotten things out on the ground. And what I'm thinking specifically, and this is really no criticism, it's just factual. The state has put a lot of money out for fast chargers, for example, and it's been successful in doing the awards, and none of them have yet been built, at least the ones that we're coordinating with outside companies. So just thinking about not just programs that have been stood up, but avenues and entities that have already built or delivered will be really important. And Rich, your comment about weatherization is spot on in terms of making sure some funding gets directed there. And we need to have that in mind when we do it. So for example, I'm just going to say it because I always do, including the other infrastructure upgrades in the homes and business, broadening our view of weatherization to include other devices and industries and upgrades, so that electricians and plumbers and other industries come in and help do the work, since we know the weatherization workforce in general has been stretched. Same when we go with EV charging, getting facilitation through the utilities, GMP and others, I think could actually be helpful, given that we have workforce planning engineers, et cetera, and also have worked with charging companies to do it elsewhere. So those are some ideas.
Thanks, Liz. Peter, we need to wrap this up, I think, and go to public comment. Am I at the right place on the agenda? And I unfortunately have another call I need to be on, a board meeting I need to be at. So I'm going to ask
happy to manage that process. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience, especially our members of the public who have stayed with us this whole time. If you would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. Right. I see Scott. Scott, would you like to make a comment to the subcommittee, please?
Yes, Peter, thank you. I wanted to speak today about passive solar technology. I would like to recommend that the Climate Council consider an aggressive use of passive solar technology as part of the climate plan. The U.S. Department of Energy has estimated that Vermont could save 5.3% of its energy use for heating buildings by such technologies. And in the Vermont Public Radio report on the approval of the cap last week, they said that the goal was to reduce building energy use by 25% in Vermont. So passive solar technology could accomplish about 1/5 of that goal. But in reviewing the Climate Action Plan and the 2018 Energy Plan, I don't see any mention of passive solar technologies. So I think there's a big opportunity for utilization of well-known and proven and simple technologies, such as sunrooms, solar greenhouses, direct gain systems, meaning south-facing windows, with or without night insulation. These are technologies that were widely used in the 1970s and 80s. And for some reason, since that time, their utilization seems to have lost some focus in the public arena. But as some of the older members may remember, there used to be passive solar retrofit tax credits at the federal level. As I mentioned, the Department of Energy had quite extensive work in the 1970s and 80s in passive solar. And it's puzzling to see to see that there's no mention of passive solar in Vermont's plans. I think there's a large opportunity to fill is the gap that I heard mentioned before from the TCIP. There's a very natural fit with weatherization activities where many of the programs that would be needed for weatherization are similar for passive solar retrofits, such as technical assistance to designers and builders, funding programs, loan programs, building code changes, education to the public and to the trades, and also partnerships with Vermont's electric utilities. Just a little bit of background on my qualifications for making this recommendation. I wrote a Master of Science thesis on passive solar technology. I worked for the Tennessee Valley Authority for a year and a half in their passive solar retrofit program. The TVA is a public electric utility that serves 6 states, about 9 million people, so about 15 times the size of Vermont's population. And then I moved to Vermont 40 years ago to help start a solar energy business in Charlotte. So there's just a few examples of the potential energy savings at a more specific level below the 5% statewide. There was a nationwide design study done by Los Alamos Scientific Laboratories that estimated that in Burlington, a sun space with 270 square feet of glass could save about 40% of the heating load of a typical house, or 53% if there were night insulation used. There was a study done by the Memphremagog group in Newport, Vermont. Andy Shapiro was the author that estimated that that found that 2 actual solar greenhouse retrofits that have been built in Vermont reduced their homes' fuel bills by 30%. And at a personal level, my wife and I designed and had built a house in Underhill that we lived in for 15 years. That it was a 1,400 square foot house with a sun space on the south side. We heated the whole house with 1 quart of wood per year. This is in a climate that's about 1,000 degree days colder than Burlington. So that house had a heat load of 1.6 BTUs per square foot per degree day. And if that kind of technology could be replicated at a broader level, it would provide a significant boost to Vermont's efforts to reduce our carbon emissions. A couple more factors on passive solar designs, advantages to passive solar, and then I'll wrap up. One is that there's no issue with siting or with transmission for passive solar because the building itself is the collector. So there are no issues as we've encountered with, for example, wind energy systems or large scale photovoltaic systems. There simply are no issues about siting. The second thing is that much of the investment that occurs for passive solar retrofits or new construction stays in Vermont. Unlike wind energy systems and photovoltaics, where a good portion of the investment goes to out-of-state businesses, with passive solar, the money goes to local builders and architects, building supply stores and the like. So it's a real boost to the local economy. With that, I've been wondering for years, does anyone have a perspective on why passive solar is not mentioned in, for example, the 2018 energy plan for the state or in the current climate action plan? Has passive solar been reviewed and it was decided that there was no real fit, or is it something that was just kind of off the radar screen?
I can speak to the climate action plan portion of the question. I can't speak to the comprehensive energy plan portion of the question. If Peter, it would be helpful for me to do that at this point in time.
You're willing to, Christine, I think that'd be fine. And in terms of the CEP, I would encourage you to reach out to TJ Poor, who has unfortunately had to go to another meeting, but he would be the one to take that comment on the CEP side. We do
recommend in the climate action plan a net zero building energy code by 2030, which would by definition incorporate passive solar principles, Scott. So I do believe through that we have globally at a higher level incorporated the concepts of passive solar. And I'm very mindful of that, having been involved in the solar industry off and on since 1979 as well. And in the clean heat standard recommended in the climate action plan, we've proposed that it embrace a number of clean heat alternatives, including solar thermal, and energy efficient construction practices, which we would define as state of the art, should include passive solar where possible. So perhaps we didn't call it out as much as you would prefer, but that was our thinking when we were doing the work.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful if it were more explicit so that people would understand what it is that's meant by a solar thermal system. Yep. I think if you asked the average person on the street what that was, you'd get a blank stare. But if you said it was a sunroom, I think almost everyone would understand what that means.
Yeah, our hope very much through the clean heat standard is to revive increased focus on passive solar and solar thermal markets moving forward, so that hopefully people on the street would be able to answer that question more like they could back in the 1980s when there was a more vibrant solar thermal market.
Okay. I would hope that it would be a much more explicit and visible part of the plan. And as I said, many of the elements of implementation would be very similar to weatherization programs, where you need to do a site analysis, you need to do an audit of the house, and then meet with the homeowner or the building owner and recommend changes, advise them on financing alternatives. It would be a very natural fit with the weatherization plan implementations. Rich, could I send this document that I prepared to you for inclusion as part of the minutes for today's meeting? Or what is the method of submitting a document to be included in today's minutes?
We've never done it, but I think you can send it to me, Scott. I'll put my email in the chat if you don't have it.
Thank you, Jane. But
typically,
thank you very much.
We've had those comments reflected in the public comment portal that we've used, not specifically in the minutes. What we do for the minutes is to refer to this video to provide the opportunity for people to watch the video and see your full comments. And then from this conversation, anybody watching this video later on should go and check the portal to have your specific write-up reflected.
Okay, thank you. And one final thing, I'd like to offer my volunteer services if there would be any use for that. If there's any need for any expertise in passive solar, I'd be glad to participate. Thank you.
We appreciate your interest and willingness to help. Thank you very much, Scott. Are there additional comments or additional members of the public who would like to engage with us? Right, not seeing any. Thank you all very much for a great meeting today. Very productive, very good conversation, and we look forward to seeing you next week. All right, take care.
Thank you.